Robert Martinez spent 28 years building a life, a home, and a future in the land he believed rewarded hard work. But one morning, a red-stamped notice changed everything. His crime? Grass half an inch too tall. In a neighborhood built on rules, he followed every one and still lost everything. This isn't a story about lawns. It's a warning about how the American dream can be measured and destroyed, inch by inch. He came to America with hope in his hands and built a life with quiet dignity. But the same soil that gave him roots turned against him because someone measured his lawn at 3 inches. It wasn't neglect. It was a tactic, a loophole. And by the time he realized what was happening, 12 families were already being erased. This is the true story of how greed hides behind bylaws and how freedom is lost without a fight. They called it a violation. He called it home. For decades, Robert Martinez kept his yard pristine, paid every bill, and followed every rule. But when land becomes more valuable than the lives on it, rules become weapons. The law wasn't broken. It was used exactly as designed. This is not about grass. It's about power, property, and the silent war happening in communities across the nation. It started with a ruler. It ended with a family losing everything. When Robert opened that notice on his front door, he thought it was a mistake. His mortgage was current, his taxes paid, his records clean. But a new kind of theft doesn't need burglars or guns. Just a rule book, a developer, and a plan. Behind the perfect fences and green lawns of suburban America, a quiet displacement is unfolding, and no one is safe from it. Welcome to Heartland Tales. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Share with us in the comments below. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the American dream shouldn't be stolen through legal loopholes, please subscribe to support our community of truth seekers. Sunshine Acres looked like the American dream built from blueprints. Perfectly planned community in Phoenix, Arizona, where every house had a 2-car garage, every lawn had automatic sprinklers, and every mailbox was painted the same shade of desert beige. The HOA had maintained these standards since 1998, keeping property values stable and neighbors content with rules everyone understood and mostly followed. Robert Martinez bought his house in 2005 during the peak of optimism about homeownership. First-generation American, son of Mexican immigrants, he'd worked construction for 15 years, saving every dollar for the down payment. The HOA fees seemed reasonable. The neighborhood was safe. His children could walk to school without crossing busy streets. For 18 years, Robert lived peacefully under HOA governance that was predictable, if not always pleasant. Annual dues of $180. Occasional reminders about trash can placement or holiday decoration timelines. Nothing that felt oppressive or unreasonable for maintaining community standards. The change began in late 2022 when 3 board positions opened simultaneously. Longtime residents who'd served for years stepped down, exhausted by volunteer duties that had grown increasingly complex as the community aged and needed more maintenance decisions. The new board members seemed enthusiastic about their civic role. Sandra Phillips, a retired real estate attorney who'd moved to Sunshine Acres 6 months earlier. David Chun, a property management consultant who claimed expertise in increasing community values. Lisa Rodriguez, who worked for a homeowner services company that specialized in HOA compliance. Their first meeting introduced what they called enhanced community standards. The old rulebook, a simple 5-page document that covered basic maintenance and neighborly conduct, was replaced by a 47-page manual detailing requirements that most residents had never heard of. Lawn height restrictions dropped from 4 inches to 2.5. Paint colors were limited to pre-approved shades available only from specific vendors. Driveway materials were restricted to types that cost 3 times more than standard concrete. Garden plants were limited to a list of 37 approved species, eliminating most of the desert vegetation that residents had cultivated for years. The enforcement was immediate and aggressive. Professional inspectors began walking the community with measuring devices, cameras, and citation books. Violations were documented with scientific precision and delivered with legal threats that made minor infractions feel like criminal charges. Robert's first citation came for his desert willow tree. Planted 12 years earlier with HOA approval, it had grown beyond the newly established height limit of 8 feet. The removal cost would be $800. The fine for noncompliance was $150 per day until corrected. Maria Santos, an elderly widow who'd lived in the community since its founding, received violations for her rose garden. The bushes that had won neighborhood beautification awards were now classified as non-approved species. Her choice was $2,000 in removal and replacement costs or daily fines that would bankrupt her fixed income within months. The Johnsons, a young military family with 3 children, were cited for playground equipment in their backyard. The swing set they'd installed 2 years earlier was now declared a non-conforming structure, requiring architectural committee approval that would cost $500 just to submit. But the lawn violations were the most systematic and devastating. The new measurement standards meant that natural growth during Arizona's brief rainy seasons would automatically trigger citations. Professional lawn maintenance was virtually mandatory, but the approved vendor list included only companies that charged premium rates for weekly service. Robert tried to comply by mowing twice weekly and measuring the height himself, but precision maintenance of desert grass during monsoon season proved impossible. The citations accumulated faster than he could address them. $150 per day, compounding into thousands of dollars within weeks. The breaking point came when Robert requested a hearing to contest the accumulated fines. The HOA's new attorney, a firm from California that specialized in aggressive compliance enforcement, responded with a lien notice. His house, purchased for $180,000 and now worth $420,000, was subject to foreclosure for $8,400 in grass height violations. The legal documents were incomprehensible to someone whose formal education had ended in high school. Terms like covenant enforcement and fiduciary obligations obscured the simple reality that his home was being stolen over lawn maintenance. Robert couldn't afford an attorney to fight the lien. He couldn't afford the daily fines that continued to accumulate. He couldn't afford to hire the approved landscaping company that would cost more per month than his mortgage payment. Desperate, Robert began talking to his neighbors about the situation spreading through their community. What he discovered was shocking in its scope and precision. The Martinez family wasn't alone. 12 other longtime residents were facing similar situations. All were older homeowners. All were people of modest income who'd bought during the community's early years. All owned properties on the 3 streets closest to the main entrance, where the largest lots offered the most potential for high-density redevelopment. Maria Santos was facing foreclosure over her roses. The Johnsons were drowning in playground equipment fines while stationed overseas. Frank Coleman, a retired teacher, owed $12,000 for a front yard fountain that had been grandfathered under the old rules but violated new setback requirements. The pattern was unmistakable once Robert started mapping it. The citations weren't random enforcement of legitimate standards. They were targeted harassment of specific residents on specific properties that would be most valuable to developers if cleared of existing homes. Robert's construction background helped him recognize what others had missed. The lots facing foreclosure were perfectly positioned for a high-density apartment complex. The zoning would support 4-story buildings. The location, near shopping and transportation, would command premium rents. The existing houses were obstacles to a development project worth millions. But understanding the scheme and stopping it were entirely different challenges. Robert had no legal training, no political connections, and no resources to fight a system designed to overwhelm individual residents with costs they couldn't afford. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert's daughter, Carmen, was a senior at Arizona State University studying journalism. When her father explained the situation, Carmen recognized it as a story worth investigating for her senior project. Carmen's research revealed that the new HOA board members weren't simply enthusiastic volunteers. Sandra Phillips, the retired real estate attorney, had been retained as a consultant by Pinnacle Development Group 6 months before joining the Sunshine Acres board. David Chin's property management company had contracts with Pinnacle for managing their rental properties. Lisa Rodriguez worked for a firm that Pinnacle used for community transition services. The HOA's new attorney wasn't randomly selected from the phone book. The California firm specialized in what they marketed as strategic property acquisition through covenant enforcement. Their website, buried behind legal disclaimers, advertised success in clearing development sites of legacy ownership obstacles. Carmen's investigation expanded beyond Sunshine Acres to other communities where Pinnacle Development had recently acquired property. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. New HOA board members with connections to the development company. Sudden implementation of impossible-to-follow regulations. Aggressive enforcement targeting longtime residents on the most valuable lots. Foreclosure proceedings that transferred property ownership at below-market prices. In Mesa, a community of military retirees had lost 37 homes to HOA foreclosures over violations including excessive patriotic displays and non-regulation flagpole heights. In Scottsdale, an established neighborhood of middle-class families was systematically cleared through citations for inappropriate vehicle storage that included pickup trucks and minivans parked in driveways. The scheme was elegant in its exploitation of legal structures that most homeowners neither understood nor questioned. HOA agreements signed decades earlier gave associations broad power to enforce community standards. The definitions of those standards could be changed by board votes that most residents never heard about. Enforcement actions were treated as civil debt collection rather than property disputes, limiting legal protections for homeowners. Carmen's journalism project became a series of articles in the Arizona Republic that exposed the systematic nature of HOA abuse across the Phoenix metro area. But newspaper articles, however well-researched, couldn't stop foreclosure proceedings or reverse lien actions that were already in motion. Robert Martinez was still facing the loss of his home. Maria Santos was still choosing between bankruptcy and homelessness. The Johnsons were still accumulating fines while deployed overseas defending the country that was allowing their house to be stolen over a swing set. The cavalry arrived in the form of someone who'd been watching the story unfold with professional interest and personal outrage. Colonel Patricia Vasquez had recently retired from the Army Corps of Engineers after 26 years of service. Her expertise in infrastructure and logistics had taken her to conflict zones around the world, but her current focus was much closer to home. Colonel Vasquez had moved to Arizona to be near her aging parents, who lived in a community where similar HOA targeting had begun. Her military background had taught her to recognize coordinated attacks when she saw them, and what was happening to Arizona homeowners looked like warfare disguised as community governance. More importantly, Colonel Vasquez understood something that the developers had overlooked in their careful planning. Robert Martinez wasn't just a construction worker trying to save his house. He was a United States Navy veteran who'd served 2 tours in the Persian Gulf during the 1990s. His service record included commendations for harbor construction projects that had supported American operations throughout the Middle East. When Colonel Vasquez learned about Robert's military service, she realized that the developers had made a critical miscalculation. They'd targeted a veteran whose contributions to American national security were documented, honorable, and worthy of protection. The press conference Colonel Vasquez organized drew attention far beyond Arizona. Standing next to Robert Martinez in his dress Navy uniform, she spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades defending American interests overseas. "I've seen what happens when corrupt systems prey on vulnerable populations," she began. "I've watched communities destroyed by people who profit from legal manipulation and systematic harassment. I never thought I'd see it happening to American veterans and communities they'd helped build and defend." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "But I've also seen what happens when good people decide to fight back. When communities organize to protect their neighbors from systems designed to exploit them. And I'm here to tell you that what's happening in Sunshine Acres isn't just about HOA regulations or property development. It's about whether we still honor the sacrifices made by people who've served this country." The story that had been confined to local news became national headlines when the full scope of veteran targeting was revealed. Robert Martinez wasn't the only former service member facing foreclosure. Maria Santos's late husband had been a World War II veteran. Frank Coleman had served in Vietnam. The Johnsons were active-duty military facing financial destruction while deployed overseas. The pattern of targeting veterans wasn't coincidental. Pinnacle Development's internal documents, obtained through Carmen's expanded investigation, showed deliberate focus on properties owned by older residents with limited resources to fight back. Veterans, with their tendency toward quiet compliance with authority and their general lack of familiarity with civilian legal systems, were identified as particularly vulnerable targets. The public reaction was swift and decisive. Arizona's congressional delegation demanded federal investigation into HOA abuse targeting veterans. The Department of Veterans Affairs opened an inquiry into systematic housing discrimination. The Arizona Attorney General launched criminal investigations into the development companies and law firms involved in the scheme. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. The story of HOA abuse in Arizona had reached communities across America where similar schemes were being implemented. Veterans organizations began organizing legal defense funds. Retirement communities started reviewing their own HOA agreements for similar vulnerabilities. Local news outlets in dozens of states began investigating development companies with suspicious patterns of property acquisition. The legal battle that followed lasted 14 months. Pinnacle Development brought in teams of attorneys to defend their legitimate business practices. The affected residents organized with help from veterans organizations and legal aid societies that provided representation they couldn't afford on their own. The breakthrough came when federal investigators uncovered the full scope of Pinnacle's operations. The company had implemented similar schemes in 43 communities across 11 states. Hundreds of families, many headed by veterans or elderly residents, had lost their homes to foreclosures based on violations that were designed to be impossible to correct. The company's business model depended on legal complexity that confused victims and enforcement procedures that moved faster than residents could respond. Most homeowners facing citations assumed they were dealing with legitimate community governance rather than coordinated property theft. Robert Martinez's foreclosure was reversed when federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against the HOA board members and their corporate sponsors. The lien on his house was removed, the accumulated fines were voided, and the grass that had triggered the entire nightmare was officially declared to be at acceptable height regardless of measurement. Maria Santos's roses were replanted with community donations and volunteer labor from neighbors who'd been afraid to help during the enforcement period. Frank Coleman's fountain was granted permanent grandfathered status under federal housing protections. The Johnsons returned from deployment to find their swing set protected by new legislation that prohibited HOA restrictions on military families. The financial settlement from Pinnacle Development provided funds to establish legal protections for HOA residents nationwide. The Sunshine Acres model became a template for communities fighting similar schemes, offering resources and strategies that had proven successful against corporate property manipulation. But perhaps the most important change wasn't legal or financial. The experience of fighting back had transformed a collection of isolated homeowners into a genuine community. Neighbors who'd barely spoken during years of peaceful coexistence had become allies in defending their shared investment in American homeownership. Robert Martinez's front lawn, the patch of grass that had nearly cost him everything, became a symbol of something larger. Not just property rights or veteran protections, but the fundamental principle that Americans should be secure in their homes without fear of losing them to legal manipulation by outside interests. On a warm spring evening, Robert stood in his driveway watering the grass that had caused so much trouble. The sprinklers were working fine, but he enjoyed the simple act of caring for his own property in his own way. His neighbor Maria waved from her rose garden, restored to its award-winning beauty. The Johnson children played on their swing set, unaware that their playground equipment had once threatened their family's financial security. The front lawns of Sunshine Acres no longer looked like battlegrounds. They looked like home again. But the victory in one Arizona community represented something more significant. Proof that the American dream of homeownership could still be defended when ordinary people refused to let it be stolen through legal technicalities and corporate manipulation. The phone calls started coming within weeks of the national news coverage. Veterans from Texas facing similar HOA harassment. Elderly residents in Florida losing homes to impossible compliance requirements. Military families in North Carolina discovering that their deployment overseas had triggered property seizure proceedings disguised as covenant enforcement. Each call confirmed the same disturbing reality. What had happened in Sunshine Acres wasn't an isolated incident or local corruption. It was a systematic strategy being implemented by development companies across America, using HOA regulations as weapons to force longtime residents off valuable property. Robert Martinez found himself becoming an accidental advocate for homeowner protection. His construction background and military experience had prepared him to understand complex systems and persistent challenges, but he'd never expected to become a national spokesman for property rights. The congressional hearings that followed revealed the scope of what legal experts called the largest property theft scheme in American history. Companies like Pinnacle Development had transferred billions of dollars in real estate from individual homeowners to corporate investors through manipulation of HOA governance structures that most residents had never read and certainly never agreed to modify. The legislation that emerged from these hearings, known as the Homeowner Protection Act, established new requirements for HOA transparency, limited the enforcement powers of corporate-controlled associations, and created federal protections for veterans and military families facing housing discrimination. But laws alone couldn't repair the communities that had been damaged or restore the trust that had been broken between neighbors who'd been turned against each other by outside manipulation. That healing required something more fundamental: the decision by ordinary Americans to care about each other more than property values. The Sunshine Acres recovery became a model for that healing process. Residents who'd been afraid to speak during the enforcement period gradually began participating in community decisions. Block parties resumed. The informal networks of mutual support that had sustained the neighborhood for years slowly rebuilt themselves around shared experience of having fought back against systematic abuse. Robert's Lawn became a gathering place for neighbors who stopped by to check on the grass that had started everything. The conversations that grew from those casual visits created connections between people who'd lived near each other for years without really knowing each other's stories or struggles. Colonel Vasquez settled permanently in Arizona, establishing a nonprofit organization that helped communities identify and resist corporate HOA manipulation. Her military experience in logistics and strategic planning proved invaluable in coordinating legal responses to property schemes that depended on overwhelming individual residents with complexity and costs. Carmen Martinez's journalism degree launched a career focused on investigative reporting about housing issues. Her senior project about HOA abuse had evolved into a documentary film that brought national attention to predatory practices targeting vulnerable homeowners across America. The developers and attorneys who'd implemented the Sunshine Acres scheme faced federal prosecution for conspiracy, fraud, and housing discrimination. Several received prison sentences. The companies involved were dissolved, their assets liquidated to provide restitution to affected families. But the most lasting impact wasn't legal or financial. The experience of fighting back had proven that ordinary Americans could still defend their communities against sophisticated attacks by well-funded corporate interests. The victory wasn't just about saving individual houses, but about preserving the principle that neighborhoods belong to the people who live in them. As Robert Martinez stood in his driveway on the second anniversary of his first grass citation, he reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. His lawn was still the same patch of desert grass, maintained to standards he set rather than rules imposed by outside interests. His house was still the same modest structure he'd worked 15 years to afford, now protected by laws that recognized homeownership as more than just another investment opportunity. But something fundamental had shifted in how he understood his place in America. The assumption that playing by the rules and minding your own business would protect you from harm had been tested and proven false. The belief that authority figures were generally acting in good faith had been challenged by corporate interests that viewed neighborhoods as profit centers rather than communities. The victory in Sunshine Acres hadn't just saved one HOA from corporate takeover. It had revealed something essential about American democracy that many had forgotten: that freedom isn't guaranteed by documents or protected by institutions alone. It's defended by ordinary people who refuse to let outsiders destroy what they've built together. The front lawns that had briefly become battlegrounds were simply front lawns again, but the people who maintained them were no longer naive about the forces that might threaten them. The corporate enforcers had moved on to target other communities, but they left behind something they hadn't intended: a population that now understood how to recognize and resist systematic exploitation. This story was brought to you by Heartland Tales. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Have you witnessed neighbors coming together to protect what matters most to their community? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you. and how their courage inspired others. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.